right. Welcome back to Transforming Social Justice. I'm Megan, the founder and CEO or Chief Empowerment Officer of Us Squared, and I am here with Justin. How are you today, Justin?
Hi, Megan. I'm doing great. It's been a weekend at home, but I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I can relate to that. It has been very busy, and we're actually prepping for our Navigating the 2024 election series, and there's just a lot going on. So we're excited to jump into this new topic today. Today, we're diving into a topic that often flies under the radar when we talk about workplace discrimination, and it's often something that's not spoken about. And in addition, it's really probably the identity or the component of how we discriminate against people that intersects the most with other identities. So today we're going to talk about lookism. And lookism is discrimination, prejudice, or stereotyping based on perceived or actual physical appearance. And this includes skin tone, body modification, clothing. It talks about hairstyle. It talks about all of the different components that make up someone's first impression just on their physicalities. Now, we're going to talk about a lot of different stories that intersect and different identities that intersect with lookism, but we specifically will keep sizeism or discrimination based on height or weight separate because that is another identity. Now, there are some intersectionalities, and I'll share some of my own stories with that, but we keep that separate because there are components that people will make or initial thoughts, first thoughts that people will make based on someone's size that is a part of lookism, but it's not all of lookism. Lookism is really a large umbrella. And again, it includes hairstyle, tattoos, body modification, clothing, skin tone. There's so many pieces that feed into that. So I'm really excited to get into it.
That's right, Megan. People who experience lookism face discrimination based on physical appearance, which can significantly impact hiring, promotions, and sometimes even salaries. And one striking statistic is that 92% of people agree that job seekers with similar qualifications are more likely to be selected based on their looks. And can you share some experiences where you felt judged or discriminated against based on your appearance?
Oh gosh. Yeah, I mean, this is where we start to talk about the intersectionality piece. I think many of our listeners know this, but I used to be much, much larger in what society and the medical field call morbidly obese. I was almost 500 pounds. And when I would go into places or when I would interview or when I would go into a restaurant, any of the above, I felt instantly judged based on what people thought with physical appearance. And I know that that's that intersectionality component, but there's so many other examples. So another example is right now, today I have curly hair. Sometimes I have straight hair. Sometimes my hair is pulled back. My hairstyle is very much an indicator of where I will be going or what I will be doing that day. I know that my hairstyle will impact someone's first impression. So when I go into a contract or I go into a new job or a workplace, really anywhere I go, I'm thinking about what do I have the rest of the day and how should I do my hair to be able to be seen, heard, welcomed, and valued the way I want to be seen, heard, welcomed, and valued. And I think as part of our work in society is we need to be aware that people are going to see us and receive us differently based on their first impressions. And at the same time, we need to be authentically ourselves. So I am authentically myself, whether I have curly hair, straight hair, pulled back, down, I'm still authentically myself. And I know that depending on how I look to someone with their first impression will determine whether they're going to lean into whatever I say or they're going to push me back or push me away because of their perception of what I look like. And I think that's critical. Um, so I will make certain decisions based on what I have for the rest of the day when I get up in the morning. That also looks at what I'm wearing, right? You know, during COVID, many of us wore what we call COVID attire. But my question is, why don't we wear COVID attire out in society? Why don't we wear whatever we're comfortable with out in society? And why was it COVID gear and not just we wear what's comfortable all the time? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that feeds into the idea of lookism because we know that society is going to look at us differently based on what we're wearing. We still need to be authentically ourselves and we need to find that balance, right? And I think those are some pieces that are really critical. So we talked about hairstyle, we talked about clothing, you know, not personally for myself, but I talked about my hairstyle. My son is going through the locking process. And what that is he is starting locks in his hair. And the first 6 months, sometimes even a year, because his hair is a little bit finer, it's not as coarse that most people have when they go through the locking process. So his hair is a little bit looser of a curl. And his hair is a mess in the initial part of the locking process. I know, and people who have ever gone through the locking process know that it is a typical look that you have for the first few months. But he has gotten so many looks out in society just because of his hairstyle. And what I know is right now, because he's still a child, he's still in school, he's not going for interviews, he's not going for those things. But if he were going for interviews and his hair looked the way it looked right now, it would be a struggle to overcome. And I think it's important for us to understand that, especially in the workforce. So when we're going for interviews, those are some of my personal examples, but we're going to talk about some other examples that we notice in society as well. That's some of my pieces. Justin, do you have any stories of how lookism has impacted you or your own kind of experiences?
Yeah, I think one distinct example that I can think of is growing up a little darker. So, like I mentioned in a few other episodes, I grew up in the Philippines, and all throughout, from elementary through high school, I ran track. So I'm always like out in the sun. Like, I'm brown, but when I was younger, I was a lot darker, and I would always be called names for that because I wasn't really very concerned about like how much darker it turned whenever it's like track season, training season, and all that stuff. And especially in like the society that I grew up in, where being lighter or having fairer skin is like looked at or seen as like quote unquote quote more beautiful in a sense. And I think uh
Yeah.
that feeds into how Filipino media or just media in general presents stuff like that.
Yeah, and we call that colorism. We talk about skin tone as one component of lookism. And in many, if not all of the Asian cultures, it is much more favorable in the society and in the cultural component to have fairer skin. And that's where so many people wear gloves and have umbrellas to go outside and cover to go outside because it is seen as such an honor to be lighter skinned. It is a privilege to be of lighter skin. And in another example of that is here in the US, for a very long time, we had what was called, in kind of different settings or kind of the urban legend, was the brown paper bag test for people of African descent. And it was literally holding up a brown paper bag. And if you were lighter than that brown paper bag, you were considered more beautiful. And it originates from a lot of components, but a big component of that is during the time of slavery here in the States, people who were of lighter skin tone were often inside the home, taking care of the slave owners and taking care of the families. And they had what was considered a better job, right? And I say that with the exclamation points and with the finger quotes because I don't think either or any of the jobs during slavery were good jobs. And there were often many components that people struggled with in all levels. But that's where it originated from. And people who were darker were out in the fields and were taking care of the crops and were taking care of the animals. And it was just a very negative piece of simply because of someone's skin tone, it was determined whether they could be inside the house or they were forced to be outside the house. And that continued for many generations. That brown paper bag test is something that people still refer to this day. And that's, I think, some of those embedded components of discrimination that are passed through people. Another thing I think about that we didn't talk about directly, but makeup, right? And self-esteem and body image. I've never been someone to wear a lot of makeup. In high school, I wore like what we call costume makeup, right? I was kind of a goth emo kid for a little bit. So I wore costume makeup, but I never really wore makeup from what society considers makeup. And probably in the last couple of years, I've started to wear a little bit. But I remember whenever I would go to an interview, I would wear makeup. And whenever I would go for a first impression with someone, I would wear makeup. But I often wonder and I question now, why is it that I wear makeup only at certain times when I'm trying to make a good first impression?
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think all of those feed into it. The media plays a big role in perpetuating lookism. It's consistently showcasing really narrow standards of beauty. I think it's gotten better over the years. But for many years, advertisements and movies featured really slim, really fair skinned models. Um, and what was really interesting is in the US, the people who identify as white were always going to the tanning salon trying to get darker. But anyone who identified as anything other than white, or as society saw as anything other than white, it was really about trying to be as fair as possible. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just really interesting to me. But media perpetuated the perfect body image. And again, it intersects with so many things. It was a certain size, a certain color tone, a certain style of makeup, a certain hairstyle, right? Um, and I think today and over the last few years, people are getting better at being vocal about wanting more authentic representation. Like, we want real bodies, featured, and we want real people featured. But it's just interesting. So I know one of the data points that we pulled up was a recent survey said that 71% of consumers believe that health and beauty brands should promote body positivity. And what they mean by that is all shapes, all colors, all ages, all sizes, all abilities. 71%. Now, back in the day, people didn't want to see anyone who looked different than the societal norm of body perfection or physical appearance beauty, right? So I love that we're getting more consumers who say, I want to be represented. I want more authentic representation. And I think this reflects a broader societal shift towards embracing diversity and challenging traditional beauty standards. There's been a lot of progress. We've seen, I think Dove is the one that stands out to me with some of the commercials that they've shown. And there's a lot of companies that have done some work in that area. But we need to make sure that we're doing ongoing efforts, not just in media, but also in our workplaces. Because every single person, like we talk about over and over, believes, or every single one of us deserve to be seen, heard, welcomed, and valued. And not just in the media, but all over in our workplaces and in society.
Yeah, and that conversation just also made me think about like dress codes or uniforms in schools, in the workplace, and like how it applies a certain pressure to individuals to conform to specific standards of appearances.
Yeah. When you talk about dress codes or uniforms in schools, it's also in workplaces, right? And I think we often will see things like professional attire required. Well, what is professional attire, right? I think it depends on what kind of workforce or workplace you're in. And we've actually worked with quite a few school districts as well as corporate agencies to help them shift their language to not say professional attire, because that word in and of itself is loaded, right? So instead of saying that, it's about being very clear of what you need and making sure it's for safety reasons. So often things that we say are no open toed shoes. Well, just say no open toed shoes because of safety. Don't say appropriate footwear, because I think it depends on what you're doing, right? If you're working on the beach, if you're a lifeguard, then the most appropriate footwear are either slides or water shoes. But
Mm-hmm.
slides or water shoes are not appropriate if, let's say, you're on a factory floor or a warehouse floor. So I think it's about making sure that you look at what is needed for the job or the company or the environment you're in, and then providing information in that way. I think about school dress codes. There's often quite a few restrictions for people who identify as female or society views them as female. There's a lot more restrictions on what they can wear compared to what boys or what society sees as boys wear. And that's interesting because that feeds into societal standards of girls need to cover up. So what we really want to look at is how can we have conversations so that everyone is respected and it doesn't matter what they're wearing, right? Instead of saying, okay, cover up so that there's no temptation, why don't we say, okay, let's have a conversation of how we treat everyone with respect, regardless of what they're wearing, right? And this goes into a whole deeper conversation around dress codes, but that's a huge discussion that we have in our schools, especially. Um, Another piece that we've had recently is discussion around the Crown Act, which is around hair and how people wear their hair and how many people were discriminated against for having natural hair. And we need to have more conversations about that. We need to understand, and I think that's the biggest piece that we talk about here at Us Squared is we need to have open, honest conversations so we can learn from one another so that we don't inadvertently show bias or discrimination towards people because of something that we don't understand or we've never experienced. So when I think about that, I want just to kind of give people some pointers, right? If you are a leader of an organization and you want to implement policies to help with some of this, then you need to look, first of all, at your HR policies. Look at your hiring practices. What are you basing your hiring decisions on? Look at your dress codes. Do you have a dress code? Look at your employee handbook. What what is written in those employee handbooks or in your policies? If you have a dress code, how is it written? Is it written with a focus on comfort and safety, or is it written on a focus of what people would think of someone if they wear something? All of those are pieces that we can do as leaders in this field to really make sure that we're providing that equitable and inclusive environment. And then again, having those conversations when they do come up or when we do notice things. It's important to have that without shame and blame and guilt and just to be open and honest with ourselves so that everyone can be their authentic self when they come in.
Yeah, and I just thought of something while you were talking about dress code, but I just remember when I was in high school, I went to an all girls school, and I remember I were only allowed to wear hair ties that are either black or white and watches that are black or white. And while you were talking about uniforms and dress codes, I was contemplating about that example that I thought of. And I'm like, it's probably not because of what we look like or for us to all look the same. It was, as an adult now, I'm thinking it's most likely to impose like control and power over us because like we were students, and I don't know, I just thought of that example.
Yeah, and I think that's an example too of, like you said, that power and control component, but it's also about conformity, right? And making sure that everyone looked a certain way. And I think that's another thing that we need to talk about is when we put such strict guidelines on people and what they look like, are we allowing people to be authentically themselves, right? We as a society will say, well, let's not draw attention. Well, I mean, as long as it's not distracting from my ability to do what I need to do, I think everyone deserves to have attention brought to them if they want. Like I think that's part of us as a human nature. Some people like to have attention, some people don't. But I think that's what makes us kind of unique and fun and special as a society is when we do have things that are unique about people. And I think it's hard when we implement dress codes or guidelines when we're not allowed to have that authenticity and that uniqueness. Now, in some ways, and I will say this, at Us Squared, I ask everyone to wear something purple when we are speaking with clients. I have some branded gear. We have some branded gear that people will wear sometimes, but I don't make anyone wear exactly the same thing. But I do ask for everyone to wear purple. The reason for that is because it allows our clients to see us. And I mean, our brand of purple is something that everyone knows, and it's something that even if people meet us for the first time, within the first or second day of getting to know me or anyone on the team, they're like, oh, purple's kind of a thing, right? The first day, it could just be
Mm-hmm.
that's what I wear. But then the second day or the third day, and they see all of the slide decks and all of our materials and our swag, they're like, oh, purple's a thing. If it's part of your brand and it's part of how you are, there's a difference there than having everyone look and feel and sound exactly the same. And even for companies that have uniforms, because I know there are some companies who require uniforms, again, if it's for safety reasons or even for brand purposes, just be aware and cognizant that you are hiring for your brand and understand and own that and just say, we're hiring people, this is what people wear because of our brand. But we have to be aware of that and we have to be able to understand that that's what's happening. And I think sometimes people want to say, oh, no, I'm not making people wear that because of control. Well, no, it is a little bit. And sometimes that's okay, because if that's your business, sometimes it's okay. But just acknowledging why it is in the first place. Absolutely.
I'm also just thinking, like in the workplace, how uh, as leaders, we can do training programs that include topics like recognizing implicit bias, understanding the impact of appearance based discrimination, promoting inclusive practices, things like that. And inclusive hiring practices are also essential, I think, and organizations need to focus on candidates' skills and qualifications rather than like appearances and first impressions, and implementing blind hiring processes where personal details are removed from resumes can help reduce some of those biases. And on the individual level, also, how can we take personal responsibility to challenge our own biases related to lookism?
Yeah, I mean, that's really where we start here at Us Squared. I mean, Us Squared is understand self, unite society. It's all about understanding ourselves before we understand others and before we unite society. So it starts with that awareness and self reflection, right? It starts with that first component of acknowledging what our biases are. When you talk about blind hiring practices, first you have to admit that you have biases when you're hiring before you even consider implementing blind hiring practices. Because if people aren't willing to acknowledge biases they have, then they won't see value in implementing blind hiring practices. So I think there are a lot of pieces there. People can educate themselves about lookism, about biases, about their own first thoughts and impressions. And they can also consciously go out and find things to do or places to go or people to meet that are different from themselves, and to really acknowledge and embrace that diversity that surrounds us. Um, and another thing that I've started trying to do, especially around lookism, is I like to give people compliments when they're earned, right? So when someone does something, I like to give compliments. And I think that also mirrors myself as well. I prefer compliments of something I've done, not necessarily something I look like or something I'm wearing, right? So making compliments or looking for things that people have done or who people are rather than what they're wearing or what they look like. Now, if someone, you can tell they're beaming, they just got a new outfit or they got a new haircut or whatever it is, absolutely giving compliments to recognize and acknowledge that you see that there's something different about them. But if we can make a shift towards our compliments being more about who the person is and what they're doing, how they're operating, rather than what they look like, then as a society, we can get past that point of just societal image of what is beautiful, right? Because I think all of us have attractive, beautiful qualities, and we hear it all the time, but beautiful on the inside and out. We need to start focusing on us as a society on more of the beauty within. And I think that will make a huge difference.
Thank you so much, Megan. But sadly, again, that's all the time we have for today. Honestly, we can go on and on. But Thank you so much. That's a lot of useful insight. And if you who is watching or listening to this have any questions that you would like to ask Megan, I, or someone from our team to answer next time, please do drop a comment, or you can also email us at info@us2consulting.com.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Check out other episodes of Transforming Social Justice available on Spotify and YouTube. We have quite a few new guests that we're bringing on to continue conversations. We have time with Jen and Meg. Jennifer Carvalho is the only person in the world who can call me Meg without my skin crawling. So have some good conversations with the two of us. And then we're also going to have some special guests on as we dive into the conversation around navigating the 2024 election. So thank you again for joining. Make sure you check us out. And if you're interested in hearing more about that series around the election here in the US, make sure you follow us on social media, register for that. And we're going to start going live in just a few short little time frames here. So we're going to start mid-August and go all the way through January. So we're very excited to continue the conversation, and remember to keep sparking those meaningful conversations, because that is where we can start to change and where we can start to be the change that we need in our world, where all communities and all people in our communities are able to be seen, heard, welcomed, and valued. Thank you so much, everyone.